For stop number 2, pit stop A, we're going to talk about how organisms, all living things, are classified and what that system is called, and the scientists that came up with a lot of that information and what we know today. So when we're talking about living things, biologists at this point in time have identified more than 1.5 million different species on Earth, and that they believe is only a fraction of what actually exists. They estimate that there could be anywhere from 5 million to 100 million different species. There's a lot of diversity, meaning there's a lot of differences. We have a lot of different species. We're talking about all living things from teeny tiny little bacteria all the way to plants and animals and humans and things like that. So because there are so many different organisms, and scientists needed to come up with a way to organize the living things. And that process, the process of organizing or classifying organisms, is called taxonomy. And that's the first blank on our notes here. Taxonomy. Taxonomy. That's the formal classification system, but that's also how we name organisms. And so we'll look at more of the broad spectrum, but it can go from some taxonomy includes things from domains and kingdoms all the way down to, you might have heard, like genus and species. So for example, if you're talking about a dog, the genus is called Canis and the species is called Lupus familiaris. So the scientific name comes from the groups that it's a part of. Humans, you may have heard referred to as Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species. So that's where the naming part comes in. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time with that, but we need to recognize that this is a whole system for classifying organisms. So some of the scientists that led us to what we know today, way back a long time ago, we're talking like, it says here BC, Aristotle was one of the first scientists to classify or organize living things. So we're going to put Aristotle. Someone that was someone who studied under him started with classifying plants into like 3 groups: herbs, shrubs, and trees. And so on that is where we started realizing that we could organize or categorize living things into different groups based on their similarities. A lot of time passed, right? And then we had someone who is pretty much credited with coming up with taxonomy, what we know as modern taxonomy. And his name is Carolus Linnaeus. So Carolus Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus. So back in like the 18th century, like 1700s, he grouped organisms into what he called kingdoms, and he grouped them based on similarities. So he looked at different characteristics and he said, well, these things have this in common, they're in this kingdom, and these have this in common, so they're in that kingdom. So he's the one that started what we know today as kingdoms. It wasn't until later, as recent as like 1990, where a scientist named Carl Woese, Carlwoese, that's how you that's how you spell his last name, although I believe that you pronounce it Woese. He did a lot of studying with ribosomes, which we talked about in stop number 1 about being part of a cell. He looked at a lot of gene sequencing. Genes has to do with like DNA and genetics, and he was able to come up with the broadest or the biggest level of classification that we have, which is called domains. So he basically came up with the 3rd domain, and so now we have 3 groups that are called domains. The bottom part of this page talks about some of the characteristics that are actually used for classification. So when these scientists were putting organisms into these groups, these domains and these kingdoms, this is what they look for, okay? So first they look at the cell structure, because we know that all living things are made of cells, right? So is it made of prokaryotic cells, which do not have a nucleus, Or is it made of eukaryotic cells, cells that do have a nucleus? And this is information that we covered in stop number 1. So we have prokaryote is what we call it if it's made of prokaryotic cells. And a eukaryote is made of eukaryotic cells. So again, this is all based on does it have a nucleus? Okay, just like what we talked about in stop number 1. Another thing that scientists look at is how many cells is it made of? We know that it has to be made of cells to be considered a living thing, but then we look at the number. Unicellular, okay, the prefix uni means one. A unicycle has one wheel. A unicorn has one horn. So unicellular is made of only one cell. So a unicellular organism is just one cell. This is stuff like bacteria, things that you usually can't see unless you have a microscope. Because remember, cells is what we can't really see with the naked eye. We have to use a microscope to look at those. Multicellular or multicellular, well, multi just means more than one. There's multiple. So these are organisms that are made of more than one cell. More than one. Another characteristic that they look at, the scientists look at, is how does that organism get energy? And ultimately we get energy through food, right? That's why we consume the foods that we do. That's the energy that our body needs to function and keep us alive. So organisms can fall into one of two categories. They can be autotrophic, which means that the organism makes its own food. The word auto means by itself, right? Like an automobile moves by itself. Automatic happens on its own. These are things like plants. We know that plants have the capacity for what we call photosynthesis, where they can make their own food. They can make their own energy. The opposite of that would be a heterotrophic organism, an organism that cannot make its own food. They must consume, which also just means like eat, right? Other organisms. We as humans would fall into this category. When I say make its own food, I don't mean go to the kitchen and like scramble some eggs and you made breakfast. I mean like actually on your own produce your energy. So we would be considered heterotrophic. We cannot make our own food. We consume other animals and we consume plants to get that energy. The last set of characteristics that are used for classification is reproduction. How do organisms reproduce or make other copies of themselves? So we have two options here. We have sexual reproduction, which is where offspring come from the mating of two parents. That's most our animals will reproduce this way, so we know that we get like part of our DNA from the male and part of our DNA from the female, and then the child is a unique set of that DNA. There's more diversity there because everyone's DNA is different. The opposite of that is asexual reproduction, which is where offspring come from one parent, and that's just basically making a copy of the parent's DNA. So there's not a lot of diversity. Everything is exactly the same as the parent. This can include things like binary fission, where bacteria cells can divide in half, or sporing, like where mold releases spores, which are reproductive cells that grow into new mold. Regeneration, for example, if a starfish loses one of its arms, that arm can grow into another starfish. So those are all forms of asexual reproduction. You'll talk a lot more about the reproduction forms in 7th grade. What we really need to know now is just the difference and understanding that that's one of the things that we use to classify organisms. These notes